this example, we are going to prepare the wages for John Jones for the first 4 weeks of the tax year, based on the cumulative basis of tax and using tax deduction cards. Before we start processing the wages, let's just have a look at John's details. We are told that he has a weekly tax credit of €70.38 and a weekly standard rate cut-off point of €700. We are given his gross pay from weeks 1 to 4. Before we commence, we can tell by looking at his gross pay that in no particular week his gross pay exceeds the standard rate cut-off point. The implications here are that all of his pay will be taxed at 20%. Firstly, we will prepare the wages for week 1 using the tax deduction card template. In week 1, John earns a gross pay of €500. The gross pay to date is also €500. We next look at his standard rate cut-off point, which is €700. Because all of John's earnings are less than his standard rate cut-off point, no portion of his pay is going to be taxed at 41%. So the tax of the standard rate will be his gross pay to date of €500 multiplied by 20%, which gives us €100. There's no tax at the higher rate, so the total tax is going to be €100. We then take away his tax credit, which is €70.38, which will leave us with a cumulative tax to date figure of €29.62. And because it's the first week of the tax year, the tax in this period will also be €29.62. We then move on to week 2. In week 2, John earns an additional €500. His gross pay to date is now €1,000. We look at his standard rate cut-off point to date, which is €1,400, and because his gross pay to date is less than the standard rate cut-off point to date, no portion of his pay will be taxed at 41%. We then multiply his gross pay to date, which is €1,000, by 20%, which gives us €200. There's no tax at the higher rate, so the total tax to date is €200. We take away the tax credit to date of €140.76, and that will give us a cumulative tax to date of €59.24. In order to get the amount of tax to be deducted in this week, we subtract the cumulative tax figure to date of €59.24 by the previous tax, which is €29.62, and that will give us the tax figure for this week, which is €29.62. We then move on to week 3, where John earns an additional €550. His gross pay to date is now €1,550. We compare that to his standard rate cut-off point to date, which is €2,100. So because his gross pay to date of €1,550 is less than his standard rate cut-off point to date of €2,100, there is no portion of his pay that will be taxed at the higher rate. So the tax will be his gross pay to date of €1,550 at 20%, which gives us €310. There's no tax at the higher rate, so the total tax is €310. We take away his tax credit of €211.14, giving us a cumulative tax to date of €98.86. In order to get the tax for this week's figure, we subtract the cumulative tax to date, which is €98.86, from the previous cumulative tax, which is €59.24, and that will give us a figure for this week of €39.62. We then move on to week 4 of the tax year. John earns an additional €575 in week 4. His gross pay to date is now €2,125, and we compare that against standard rate cut-off point of €2,800. Because his cumulative gross pay to date is less than his standard rate cut-off point to date, there is no portion of his pay that will be taxable at 41%. So all his earnings to date of €2,125 will be taxed at 20%, giving us a tax of €425. There is no tax at the higher rate, so the total tax is €425. We subtract tax credit to date of €281.52, which will give us cumulative tax to date of €143.48. In order to get the tax for this week, we subtract the cumulative tax to date from the previous cumulative tax, and the difference is the €44.62. When you're preparing tax deduction cards, at any stage, when you add up the individual tax for to date, it should always equal the cumulative tax figure. So when I add up these four figures individually, I should always come to the €143.48.